Hilchis Matnas Aniyim Perik Shlishi. We're dealing now with the halachos of Peah. The nekuda of the Perik is that Peah has to be given on each field separately. You can't give from one field to another field. The question is, when is it considered two separate fields? But if it's two separate fields, there's a special din that you have to be mafresh Peah on each field. That's pashut, you can't be mafresh Peah mimin al sheini minei. The chiddush over here is that even if it's talking about both of them are the same min, but you can't be mafresh from one field and another field, which is different than trumas and maises. By trumas and maises, you could be mafresh from one field. There's no din that has to be nifresh from that field. Mashenki, you can even be mafresh from someone else's produce on your produce. Mashenki my Peah, there's a special din that it has to be nifresh from that soda. Perik shlishi. Eima nichnas hapeya misoda al chaverto. Ketzad. Hoyu leish day sodas. The same person owned two fields. Liyikter sa'achas kula. In v'yaniach b'shniya Peah haruya l'shteyim. He's a mafresh Peah from one field for both fields. Shenema l'sechala pa'as sodcha b'kutzrecha. So we learn out sheyaniach b'chol achas v'achas Peah haruya l'shteyim. Pas sodcha, that soda you have to leave the Peah. Now, if you did leave from one field on another field, there's ain't a Peah, so that doesn't have a Shem Peah. And therefore, first of all, the first field is still Chayiv b'Peah. He's still Chayiv b'Peah. Like we learned, even if you cut it, you'll have to leave. You have to give from the Shibolim and even from the Kamach, and you have to always be mafresh from that field Peah. And also the Peah that you are mafresh on another field doesn't have a Shem Peah. So Mela is Chayiv and Trumas Amaisis. Peah is potter from Trumas Amaisis. But this Peah is Chayiv with Trumas Amaisis. The Shaila would be, Moshe B'Emes Peah has no Shiur. So what happens if a person, Moshe, has two fields, and then he's mafresh from the second field on the first field as well? In other words, he's mafresh, let's say you have to be mafresh midrabon a 60th. So he was mafresh from the second field, a 60th for both fields. So he had kavanah for both fields. So the first field certainly is Chayiv b'Chala. The question is, this Peah, which he was mafresh for both fields, do we say that like that's a clear that the Derech Hamunah of Chaim Kanievsky clears b'nigea, what's this din? And since he was mafresh for both fields, so does it have a din like Tevel v'chul and Muravin Zebazah? In other words, part of it is mechuyev b'maiser and part of it is not mechuyev b'maiser. Or do we say no, that since part of it is the Peah, so even though he was mafresh on both fields, it has a din of Peah. That's a clear. But I'll call upon it's posher that if it was mafresh Peah from this field for that field, it had nothing to do with this field. He was only mafresh for the other field. So then the other field is chayiv, and this Peah is mechuyev b'trumas u'maisos. Halacha beis hoisa sodeu zrua kula min echad. This field was planted with one min. V'hoyanachal b'tei chasad, and in the field there was a stream, natural stream. Afal pi she'eini meishach, even though it's not a flowing stream. Oy amas hamayim, an irrigation ditch. She'eini yochel, when if we're dealing with an irrigation ditch, it has to be wide enough. She'eini yochel likzer ma shebishnei tzodel ka'achas. Because you can't bend over the irrigation ditch and cut what's on the other side of the irrigation ditch. And v'hu also shetia mishaches ukvua. It's something which is a flowing ditch. In other words, the water is flowing in it, and it's a kavua ditch. It's a permanent ditch, a permanent irrigation ditch. Is harei zeh kishtei sodis v'neisen Peah mitzadzel la'atzmi mitzadzel la'atzmi. Is nachamol. If you have a field, which in that field is either a nachal, if it's a nachal, so even if it's not a flowing nachal, or if you have an amas hamayim, an irrigation ditch, and in that there's tnoim, the tnai is that it should be that you're not able likzer mashibnei tzodel ka'achas, and also it should be mishaches ukvua. So b'chiyai gavna, it's considered two sodas, and memeli you have to give a Peah for each side separately. Halacha gimel v'chein im hoye mafsik derech hayochid. If you have a derech hayochid that passes, there's a derech that goes through the field. Now derech hayochid has to be shehu rochiv arba amas. It's 4 amas wide. Oy derech harabim, which is harochiv sheish esrei am. You have a derech harabim. A rabim is using this derech. Then it has to be wide 16 amas. So then that's also considered a hefsek between the two fields. If you have a field, and in that field is a derech hayochid of 4 amas or a derech harabim of 16 amas, that's considered a hefsek. Aval, if you have a shvil hayochid, what does it mean a shvil hayochid? It's not a derech, it's only a path. Of course, v'hu pachas mi'arba, because it's less than 4 amas wide, so it can't be called a derech, it's only called a shvil. a shvil rabin, it's only a path, because it's pachas mishesha seyama. So then it depends. If it's something that people go both during this summer and the winter. In the winter, it's harder to go because over there's already things are growing. That's when the fields are growing. In the summer, people go more. So if it's a path which you go, so then it's mafsik. But mesak shamim it's not used, then any mafsik alareu kusadachas is nachamo. If you have a derech, if that derech is a derech hayocher of 4 amas or derech harabim 16 amas, so even though it's not used all the time, but l'peil is considered a hefsek. Masha'inkin, if it's a derech which is less than 14 amas of 4 amas of a yochid or 16 amas of a rabbin, so then it's not called a derech, it's called a shvil. So when is that called a hefsek? That's only called a hefsek if it's used on a regular basis. Now l'chur you'll ask that l'chura, if a derech of yochid, which is 4 amas wide, is considered a hefsek, even if it's 4 amas wide. So how could it be that l'mashal you have a derech harabim and it's 10 amas wide? That's not called a hefsek. So the pshat is because a derech hayochid is takins his derech, because we'll assume that that'll be a permanent derech. Masha'inkin a rabbim, if a rabbim is using a derech which is so narrow, so presumably that they'll eventually find a different derech. This is not really a good derech for them because it's so narrow. And therefore we'll assume that they'll find a different derech. So either using it b'peil. So again, you have to say, if they're using it b'peil, saib mesak sham, so that's called a hefsek. Mashenka, if they're not using it b'peil a whole year, there's a derech. So we say, no, if it's less than 16 amos, it's not called a derech. Halacha dalet. Now meanwhile, we learned that there could be a hefsek of a nachal or an amos hamayim. That's one option, or 2 options. And then there's a hefsek of a derech, either a derech hayochid or a derech harabim, and all there's a shvil hayochid or shvil harabim. They have their dinim. That's the types of hefsek. Now there's another hefsek, halacha dalet. Hoye mafsik bo eretz bura. You have a hefsek between the 2 sides of the field with an eretz bura. What does eretz bura mean? She'ena zruah v'lei charusha. It's a fallow piece of land that wasn't planted, nor was it plowed. Oy eretz nira. What's the eretz nira? A piece of land that was plowed but it wasn't planted. That's another option. A 4th option, you have something, you have a field that's planted, and in between, in the middle of the field, you have a zeracher. And obviously there was a division enough to separate from kalayim, but lepeil, in the middle there's chita mikan seidim be'amtza. Oi, another option, shekotzer be'amtza, you cut the middle of the field, afilu kedim shetavi shlish, before it even brought a shlish, and v'chorash became shekotzer, and now you plowed and became shekotzer. Because if you didn't plow, then became shekotzer, so then it's considered like one ktsira. You know, you started cutting the middle of the field, and now you're going to continue cutting the rest of the field. But over here, you cut the middle of the field, you harvested the middle of the field, and then you went and you were choresh, became shekotzer. So then again is arezu nifsekas l'shtei sodas. That's called a hefsek l'shtei sodas. That's called the hefsek l'shtei sodas, and mainly that's a division. So again, so we have the hefsekas l'shtei sodas, we have the nachal, we have the amos hamayim, we have the derech, and we have the eretz bura or eretz nira, and then we also have that it was chita mikan v'chita mikan useirim be'emtza, and now we're having another case that it was kotzer be'emtza, and then you were choresh, so then it goes back to al derech via eretz nira. So this is a prat l'chur in the eretz nira. Now the Rambam says eisha kotzer be'emtza afilu kedim shetav ishlish v'choresh makom shekotzer. What does it mean afilu makom kedim shetav ishlish? In other words, the word is the chura. There would be a svara that if you were kotzer in the middle kedim shetav ishlish, it's a hefsek even without a choresh, because then it's like a din of an eretz bura. It's an eretz bura. Notice it's empty. There was never anything there. Nothing. Everything grew. So vice versa. That's the chiddush. No, that if it was since it started growing, so in order for it to be a hefsek, you have to have choresh. There's eisha kotzer b'mtzoah, nafilu kedim shadav ishlish. Even if it was kedim shadav ishlish, but it has to be also v'choresh b'makom shekotzer. So then is a reason of sekos l'shtei sodas. V'hu sheyir rechiv kolechad mi'elu k'shleisha tlamim shel pasiach. Whereas the width of this eretz bura, this eretz nira, has to be the width of shleisha tlamim shel pasiach, 3 furrows that you'd make with a plow. The 3 faras which you make on a plow, v'hu pachis me beis reva. And that's less than the width of a beis reva. Now, beis reva, we learned before, the width of a beis reva is 10.2 amas by 10.2 amas. That's a beis reva. So in Mela, the shleisha tlom shel pasiach is less than 10.2 amas. So we're saying that this hefsik that we're saying of eretz bura or eretz nira, or if you cut in the middle and you acharish makom shekatzar, all these places have to be at that width, that level of width that it should be a hefsik. That this level of hefsik, which is saying shleisha tlom shel pasiach, is enough of a hefsik. B'sodiktana, we're dealing with a small field, shehi chamishim amma al shtei amas, which is only 100 amas. In other words, 100 amas square. Chamishim amas al shtei amas, a pachas. So then a small hefsik would be enough. This hefsik of shleisha tlom shel pasiach. Avalim hoisi yiserazu, but if you have a larger field, is ein abur a hanir mafsika l'shtayim elim kein hoya be reicha beis reva. So in order for that to be a hefsik, it has to be the reicha of a beis reva, which the reicha of a beis reva is, we said, 10 amas, 0.2. 10 amas and a fifth of an am, the erech. So nachamol. So there's the shiur that we had before, which was again nachal and an amas amayim and a derech. That was one din of those shiurim. That they were not dealing with those shiurim. Now we're dealing with a place that's a mokum bur, a mokum nir, an eretz bura or an eretz nira. So over here there's another din. So over here the shiurim is that it has to be shleisha tlom shel pasiach. If it's a small field means that it's not more than 100 amas square, which is 50 by 2 amas. Masha'inkin, if you have a larger field, so in order for it to be considered divided, this field to be divided, there has to be the width of a beis reva there in order for it to be considered divided. And the width of a beis reva means 10 amas, 0.2 amas berach. That's when we're dealing with a bur and near aval zera acher. But if you have another type of species planted in between, like you said before, chitim mikan, v'chitim mikan, useirim be'emtza, so there's no shir aval zera acher kol shum afsik bo. As long as something was planted in the middle, so no matter how wide it is, it's considered a hefsek. Halacha hey, achla goyvai, ekir semu nemolim be'emtza. So again, so if in the middle there became, in other words, it was cut not by you, but it was cut through the goyvai, the heshrik, grasshoppers, or nemolim ants. Is in choresh makim sha'achlu zarizam afsik. Just like he said before, that if he cut it when it was a pachs mishlish, so in order for it to be considered a hefsek, it has to be choresh afterwards. Al derech zeh, by achle geva or kisamu, in the molim, it has to be choresh in order for it to be a hefsek. Halacha vov, hazireya bahar she'eni kuli shava. You're planting on the side, on the slope of a mountain. So it's not really straight land. Eliyesh beitilim gveim. There's places that are tall, and also in Mekaymis Hamukim there are places that go down that go down deeper. So knows side there's depth over there, and side there's height. Knows it's b'chlal not a straight piece of land. There's no way of actually plowing and planting it together because of this, the way it's set up this piece of land. It's on the slope and it goes down and goes up. But lepel, since that's the seder hadvarim, is arezek yisod achas, because that's the seder of how a mountain is. A mountainous area. That's the way it is. The slope is higher and lower. Therefore, maniach peah achas b'seifa hor al kol hor. So you could put one peah on the entire mountain, on the entire side of the mountain. Now, if you have l'moshel of a regular field, and in that field you're making steps, you're making like terraces, madreges shein guveyes asoret tvachim. You have in a field, a regular flat field, you're making areas which are terraces. In other words, so you're making larger places which are taller, and they're 10 tvachim tall, which is considered like a separate rishus. So then is neisen peah mikolachas vachas. Then you have to give peah from each of those steps. Whereas if you have an area which is you're growing on a field and you make madregas, steps, terraces in the field, so each terrace, which is 10 tvachim tall, is considered a separate field, and therefore you have to give a separate pay. Now, if at the end of those they're taka like 10 above each other, But on the other hand, at the end, they merge together. They merge together. They at the end of the row, they merge together into one. Im hoyu Rashi Shuris Muravim. So then is Neisen Miachas Alakil. Then even though the whole way they were considered together, but since at the end they merged, so therefore Neisen Miachas Alakil. Hoyu Pachas Masara. However, if they were never 10 tefachim, they weren't 10 tefachim tall in the first place. Is Aval Pisha Ein Rashi Ashuris Muravim. So nevertheless, is Neisen Miachas Alakil. Since it's not 10 tefachim tall, so they're not considered separate. If there was a cellar going across the entire field, is in other words, in order to plow the entire field, he'll have to pick up the plow. He can't go through. He'll have to pick up the plow and then put it on the other side. So you can't really plow the entire field together. Is mafsik, that's called a hefsik. If you're able to go through this cellar, somewhere or another, there's a place to go through this cellar, is ain't a mafsik, you don't have to be mafsik. Now, just before Taka, we learned Beneged Efsekim, so it's brought down. The Chamuna brings that Lamashal, if you have, let's say, you have a shvil, you have a place which is being mafsik the two sadas, and Lepel at the end, you have an area which the two sadas combine. And those, if these Hefsekim that he's speaking about in the beginning of the parak, all these Hefsekim, they go through the entire field, so that's called a Hefsek. What happens if they don't go through the entire field? So he brings 2 days. One day is that as long as there's 4 amas in which the fields are combined, so even though part of the field is this hefsik, this nachal, or this nachal, or this eretz bura, but since there's 4 amas in which the field is combined, so that causes that the field should have a din of 1 field. Then he brings another day, even less than 4 amas, as long as it doesn't go across the entire field, so it's considered united, the field, even though there's this big hefsik in between. So over here also we're seeing such a din, benigea, this cellar, that the cellar has to go through al pnei kol hasoda. That seems to be. Halacha ches. Hazirei hasoda sheyesh ba ilonos. You plant, there's a field that has trees in it. Now you planted this field, and you didn't plant the whole field as one field. You planted the field, there's different squares. You made different malbenis, different squares of areas which planted, which each square seems to be separate. Now normally if you planted in such a manner, so the pastures, that would be considered 2 separate fields. And since they would be considered 2 separate fields, you'd have to give Peah from each field. Mashenkan over here, since there are trees there, so Be'etzem, the reason why, and the trees are like part of the field, so the reason why you're planting it malbenis is not because you really want to plant it as separate fields, but rather because the trees are forcing you to plant it malbenis. So therefore we don't look at this growth as separate fields, but rather we look at it only as being one field. When we assume that the reason why you planted malbenis was because of the trees. But if there are not that many trees, so no, there's no 10 trees in one besah, so then we assume that the reason why you planted malbenis is not because of the tree, but rather because you wanted to make separate fields, and therefore they have a din of separate fields. That's this din. Halacha ches. Hazirei hasoda sheyesh be'ilonos. Is afal pisha malbenis bein ha'ilonos. You're planting it malbenis squares bein ha'ilonos. And the ein kol hazera me'urev, they're not really mixed one with the other. Nevertheless, is neisen peah achas l'chol hasoda. We don't consider it as separate fields. Why? Shadav yidua shesoda achas be'emes, it's one field. Mipnei became ha'ilonos nachlik hazera. The only reason why you made it malbenis, you were machalik the zera, and they're not mixing with each other, is because of the ilonos. Bamed dvarim amurim b'shahoyu ilonos kol hasoda b'tech beisah. Each beisah had 10 trees. So then we consider it that there's a lot of trees in the beisah, and therefore you had to cause it that you should plant it malbenis. Avalim kol hahoyu kol hasoda ilonos b'yesim beisah. So in other words, it wasn't really so densely populated with trees, the area, because there was asori ilonos b'yesim beisah. So therefore, is areza nesin peah mikol malbin u'malbin. Shahar ilonos is achmeruchakim harbi. The trees are that distance from each other. And v'lei mipnei ilonos zara malbenis, but because you wanted to make it 2 separate fields. And memela, so therefore it's considered separate fields, and therefore you have to be mafresh from each one. V'chein nochadin. If you have malbenis hapsolim shebein hayerek, you have psolim, which you have malbenis of psolim, and there's yerek in between. Shebein hayerek, there's yerek in between the malbenis hapsolim. So the question is, the Yerek is being mafsik between Malbenis Apsolim, and Mela, she should have to give from each Malben Apsolim a separate Peah. So the din is Nesim Peah Achas L'chol Apsolim. Afal Pisha HaYerek Mavdul Bineim, Umisima Malbenis, and nevertheless it's considered one field. Now what's the Avonas Hadvarim? So it's brought down two things. First of all, it's brought down that a botzel is also a min yerek, so it's not really considered a hefsek. I don't know, you have to, I'm not sure. As we learned earlier, Bamis yerek is bichlana, and also the Radva says yerek is not mechuyev in Peah. We learned before Bamis in the beginning of Perek Beis that yerek is not mechuyev in Peah. But psolim, if psolim, which you're gonna dry it in order for the zera, so that is mechuyev in Peah. So over here we're talking about the psolim is mechuyev in Peah. The yerek be'etzim is not mechuyev in Peah. But on the other hand, botzel is a min yerek. So somehow, because the yerek is really not mechuyev in Peah, and a yerek on the other end is a min botzel, a botzel is a min yerek. So somehow or another, the yerek, which is in between the malbenis of psolim, is not considered a hefsek. It still needs a hesber, but that's I think what it says in the Radvaz. That's how the Radvaz explains it. Halacha Yud Aleph. Soda shekulo zrua min echad. V'kiven shehiskol bo mekemis liyabish, okar itolish mashiyovish mikan u'mikan, at shenisher halach mefured malbenis meruchok mizu. So you have a field, that part of the field became ripe, started to become dry. So and the other part is still needs to grow. They're not ripe yet. So you went ahead and you cut the parts that were dry, the parts that were ripe already, and now you left the rest of the field, and the rest of the field looks like it's patches of produce. In other words, it doesn't look anymore like a whole field. You cut already part of the field, but you left the rest of the field like patches. So the question is, the question is two questions. One question is whether you could be mafresh from one malbin on the other malbin, from one patch on the other patch. So we look at it as one field or two fields now on these patches. And also there's really another question, which the Rambam doesn't mention here in Halacha Yud Aleph, he mentions it in Yud Beis, whether you could be mafresh from the produce that you left on the field and that you will eventually cut on the produce that you already cut, which was the yavish. In other words, are they considered, do you have to be mafresh on the yavish separately or on the lach separately? So there's two questions. So here says it. In other words, if this type of produce that was growing here were something which people grow from it, patches, kigen sheves, ichardel, dill, or mustard, is arezu miniach peah mikol malbin or malbin. You have to leave peah from each patch. And also, you have to leave separately peah for the parts that you cut originally, which was the yavish. From kol malbin or malbin, you have to leave peah. So koskein, you have to be mafresh from the yavish separately and from the lach separately. Shareya emer arugas nizru. However, v'imhoyim min echad shezer nesisadis. If v'imhoyim min echad, it was a min shezer nesisadis, which you plant as a field. Going tvuah v'kitnis is then nesnachas lakel. So then you could give one lakel, which means from one malbin to the other malbin, and also from the lach on the yavish. Now, b'medvar mamurim that we say that you could give from the lach on the yavish. That's on this part. Is yavish mikan v'yavish mikan v'lach be'emtza. So in other words, you had a field, and on one side, let's say on the end of one side of the field, on the other end as both ends, you had yavish. So you started cutting from the ends of the field, and in the middle you had parts that was lach, and in that lach there was also yavish. So therefore, it ended up being malbenis. Obviously, in the lach there's also yavish, because that's, or else it wouldn't be end up being malbenis. But there was also the yavish was mikan and mikan. You started cutting it from the ends of the fields. In other words, the ends of the fields are all lach, and what you cut was the middle of the field. So then now you can't rely on what's going to be cut later for the pay of what you cut now. Why? Because it's not a regular thing to cut a field from the middle. So then is miniach min hayavish b'fnei atzmi. This yavish which you cut, which was be'emtza asada, you can't say, well, this is like considered the tchila of the cutting of the rest of the field, because people don't start cutting from the middle of a field. So over here you have an area which you're cutting, and that's the only area which is really ready to cut right now. So memela is miniach min hayavish b'fnei atzmi umin halach b'fnei atzmi. This area which you're cutting right now, which is the yavish b'fnei atzmi, you have to leave peah, and then later on when you're going to cut the lach, you're also going to leave Peah min halach b'fnei atzma. Halacha Yud Gimel. And then again, the pashtus, if there's type of produce which is normally planted as fields, so then you could give from one part of the lach for all of the lach. And if this produce which is normally planted as patches, so then you'll have to give from each malbena anyways, each one separately, which would be the same halacha like an halacha Yud Aleph. Halacha Yud Gimel. Sada shizarab solim epulim eafunim ekietzben. You plant it with onions or with beans or with peas. V'hoye bedaite limker mikzosim lachem bashuk. Some of it you wanted to sell fresh in the market, and also maniach mitzvah sasoda yovish. And part of it you wanted to leave in the field to dry. V'yasim imenu gerin, and then you'll gather it together, make a gerin. Is chayiv laniach peah. So you have to chayiv laniach peah lezeh shemecher lach b'fnei atzmei. The part that you're being meichel, so since in your mind you're planting something, and you're intending on part of it to be sold freshly as fresh produce, and part of it to leave to dry out and to gather and to have into your storehouse, so then you have to leave two separate payas. Chayav l'avniach payah l'zeh shemeichel lach b'fnei atzmei, and also l'zeh sheketze yitzu yovish b'fnei atzmei. That's in the case it's the one field, and l'churi it's mamish one field and one min. But nevertheless, since you have in mind part of it to use as to sell lach, and that's a proper selling, and it's a proper harvesting. You're harvesting now the lach, and then you're going to harvest the yavish. So that's considered like separate, and memeli you have to give two separate pays. Halacha Yudalit Hazireya Sodeo Minachot. He planted it one min. Is afal pisho yisei shtei granis. He's going to gather it into two separate grain heaps. He's going to two separate piles. Is nevertheless meniach peyachas. He should be meniach peyachas. One pay because it was one field, and enochinami he's dividing it into two gruns, but that doesn't make it into two fields. However, zora shnei minim, if he plants a field with two minim, afal pishu eisei seger nachas, he's going to gather and it's all going to be in one heap. Is nevertheless neisen peyel min zebefnei atzmi or peyel min zebefnei atzmi. You can't be mafresh peya mimin al sheini minei. Now, zora shnei zroim miminachot. From the same type of, in other words, same type of grain, but there's two subdivisions in that grain. Gegoin shezora shnei mini chitim. He has two types of wheat. A shnei mini seirim with two types of barley. So then the gerin determines im osim gerin nachas. If he made it into one heap, in other words, he cut it all together and he put it into one heap. So then is neisen peyachas. Then it's enough to give one pay. However, if he's going shtei granis, if he's making it to two separate heaps, so then neisen shtei payas. And the davar zeh is halacha l'meish misena, is nacham. Normally we say shtei, if it's the same field, so shtei granis is still one payah. If it's two separate minim, so even if it's a ger and achas, it's still two payas, because you can be mafresh min shein minim. Masha'enkin, if it's two subdivisions within the same min, does you have shnei mini chitim or shnei mini seirim? So then, if it's a ger nachas, it's considered one, and if it's shtei granis, it's considered two. Halacha tezayin. Ha'achin shecholku is neisen shtei payas. Two brothers yashed the field from their father, then they divided the field and they cut the field. So the chi of pay is chal b'shas aktsira. So mainly each one has to give a separate pay. Now chazru v'nishtatvu, they became shutfim again. First they divided and then they became shutfim. Is neisen pay achas, and der Chamoni he brings Reb Chaim Kanievsky that this din is also lav dafke by shutfim. In other words, it sounds like since they were once brothers and now they were chazru v'nishtatvu. But the same thing would be if you have two separate people that have nothing to do with each other and they have fields next to each other, and then after the fields grew, they became shutfim. They became shutfim together, and now they're cutting the field as shutfim. So then the same thing would apply. Since Lepel right now they're shutfim, even though it grew separately, it was originally separately, but now they're shutfim. So nevertheless, since they're harvesting it as shutfim, so melas peyachas. That's what he writes. Halach weiter hashutfim shekotru chatzi asod. They cut half of the field as shutfim. V'acharka cholku, and then they divided the field. So now there's the part that was cut already belongs now to one brother, and the part that wasn't cut belongs to the other brother. Is there shalokach hakotzer enim afrishku? The one that took the harvested produce, the cut part, it doesn't take anything. Doesn't have to be mafresh anything. V'zeh shelokach hakama, and the one that took the kama, the part that wasn't cut yet, is mafri ala chetzi shelokach bulvat. Over here, he's only mafresh ala chetzi shelokach. So nochmal a chidush, that a person, they had a field, and they went ahead and cut half of the field. Now obviously the intention was to be mafresh on this half from the other half. In other words, they're going to finish cutting it, which means they're going to cut the other half. So that's when they're going to be mafresh peah on the entire half. Then, meanwhile, after they cut half, they divided it, and the part that was cut belongs now to one person, and the part that wasn't cut belongs to the other brother. So the din is the one that was cut obviously doesn't have to do anything, because Lepel there was no chi of chal until the end of the field, so Mela there was no chi of chal. And now the other brother also, which got the kama, doesn't have to be mafresh on the part that was cut, because Lepel on the part that was cut as shutfim, and the chi of was a chiyuv of shutfim. Masha'enkin, since now that part the second part was sold, and that second part was sold, so this part that was sold, that's mine, I have to be mafresh. But the part that was originally going to have to be nifresh from the second half, so that part that was nifresh from the second half, now the second half was sold. Since the second half was, like, so to speak, now belongs to one person, doesn't belong to the shutfim, so mele, the chiyuv peah, which was chal on the first half, al din shutfim, can't be chal now on the second half, which is now it's a din yochid. So Mamela, it was taka chal on the second half if the second half was shutfim. But since the second half now belongs to a yochid, so the yochid is not mechuyev on the chiyuv that was chal al shutfism. So dvar chidush. Whereas earlier we learned the halacha that if a Moshe, you have a situation where a person owned the field, and he cut half of it, and then he sold the other half to someone else. So the din is that someone else has to be mafresh, say on his part that he got, and say on the part that was already belonged to the original owner, which was cut originally by the original owner. L'chur, it's the same idea. Over here, the same idea. Over here, originally they were cut as shutfis, and then the plan was to be mafresh from the other half. And now that the other half belongs to this one person, so l'chur, why doesn't he have to be mafresh from the first half? Just like in the case where Katzer chetzia, and then he was macher the other chetzia. So the second person gives it also on the first person. So on that, the explanation is, in the original case, it belonged to one person. He belonged to one person. And his original plan was that the peah is going to be nifresh from the second half. Now we assume that when he sells the second half, that part that he sold the second half, he didn't sell the part that was supposed to be peah. The part that was supposed to be peah, he didn't sell. That was still peah. And Einochinami, we mentioned that legabi dinim momris, if the second person didn't know about this thing that he already cut the first half, so mitzad hilchas dinim momris, he doesn't have to attack a pay for the whole second half, because he could tie it. That part is peah, and that part was never sold. I'm not selling you something which I cut, and I intended on bringing peah from the second half. That part that was peah, I never sold, and that's still mine, so to speak. It was still peah. And mamela, you have to be mafresh peah. Masha'enkin, in the case over here, you're making a division. And since you're making the division, so mamela al karchav, this half is this brother's, and this half is this brother. So the entire half now belongs to this brother. So now we have to clear. The first half was cut with the intention of giving from the shutfis the peah for the first half. But now there's no shutfis to give for the first half, because now the second half belongs to one person. So just like if, let's say, the second half would become completely, it would be stolen, it would be burnt. So obviously you wouldn't have to be mafresh for the first half, because the peah was in the second half. So over here also, the second half no longer exists, because there's no second half that belongs to shutfim. And therefore the din is that now you don't have to give from the second half. This person that got the second half, which is now taka his, doesn't have to give any peah for the first half. It's a davar mechudish, but lepel, that's the halacha. It's a clear halacha here. That achim that nachamol. So achim that they cut the first half al shutfis, and then they divided now the first half and the second half. So the person that got the second half only has to be mafresh the peah on his second half, but he doesn't have to be mafresh the peah for the first half. Masha'enkin, if a person would have cut the first half himself and then sold the second half, so the buyer would have to give from the second half also for the first half. Now, chazru v'nishtatfu. So what happened was they cut the first half as shutfim. Then he sold Then they divided it. Now they have the second half, and he has the second half, and now the kotzru, and now chozru v'nishtadfu. Now they became shutfim again in the second half, and the kotzru achotzi acher b'shutfis, and now they're cutting the second half b'shutfis. So kol echad mem mafrish michelke shebekama al chel chaveri shebekama avalei al achotzi sheniktzar. Since sof kol sof, after they cut the first half b'shutfis. So the rule was that they're going to be mafresh from the second half, which is b'shutfis. Lepel, the second half, which was b'shutfis, was no longer b'shutfis. Why? Because it was divided. Now it belonged to one person. So at that point in time, they became a ptur. There's no chiyah to be mafresh from the second half for the first half, like we just learned. Now on the second half, they became shutfim again. But the fact that they became shutfim again is not going to renew that chiyuv that they had on the first half originally, because once that shutfis was divided and the second half belongs to one person, so that is far found. Now that they became shutfim again in the second half, now there's two people own the second half, so fine. So two people own the second half. So just like when shutfim own a property, so each one is mafresh from his half on the other half. In other words, they have to be mafresh to pay it together. So Alderas over here, each one could be mafresh on the other half of the second half. Masha'inkin beneged, the ptur that was chal on the first half through the original division, that doesn't change. That doesn't change. That's this deal. Halacha Yud Zayin. Soda sheigia chetzia atshlish. You have a soda which half of it already reached a third of its produce. Now the chiyuv of Peah is chal when it's higia atshlish. So half of the field was already higia atshlish, and v'chetzia lehigia, the other half was not higia. Now v'hiskil v'kotzar b'chetzi sheigia chetzia. He started cutting that half which was higia chetzia, and while he was cutting the half that it was higia chetzia, is v'achar kach hivia kulashlish. Then he was hivia kulashlish, and v'achar kach gomar hachetzi arishon sheigia b'tchil. So there's three parts of this field. Nachamol. There's the first half of the field, which was originally was hivia shlish. Half of the field was hivia shlish. Now we went ahead. Let's assume, and he cut half of that half. He cut a quarter of that field. Quarter of the field that it was hivia shlish here. He cut already. Now, before he finished cutting that half of that hivia shlish, the second half also was hivia shlish. And now he went ahead and cut the second half and also the rest. So he cut the rest. Now the question is, which one is considered one field legabi peyos? Is nacham. Soda sheigia chetzi shlish. Half of the field reached already a shlish. And v'chetzi leigia, the other half didn't reach. And v'hischil v'kotzar b'chetzi sheigia chetzi. And he started cutting that half, which was higia shlish. He didn't finish cutting that whole half. He started cutting it. V'acharkach, after he cut part of that field, let's say he cut a quarter of it, a half of that field, of that half, is v'acharkach hivia kula shlish. And now the other half, which originally didn't bring shlish, now was hivia kula shlish. V'acharkach gomer hachetzi arishon shegia betchila. And now he was gomer, now he finished cutting the first half. Now he finished cutting the first half. So you have the half of the first half, which he cut before the second part was hivia shlish. You have the second half of the first half, which was hivia shlish together with the first half of the first half, which was also hivia shlish together. And now you have the second half, the whole second half, which was hivia shlish together with the second half of the first half. In other words, you have three parts over here. Maybe we're making it more complicated than it is. You have three parts over here. In order to be mafresh peah from one on the other, they have to be one field. So l'mashal, the first half that you cut before the second part of the field was b'chlal hivia shlish have nothing to do with each other, because they were never really ba'olam echad. They were never together. Before that second half of the field was hivia shlish, this first half of the first half was already cut. Masha'en came the second half of the first half. So on one hand, it's together with the first half of the first half because they were hivia shlish together. The first half and the second half were hivia shlish together. So mainly they're obviously one field. the second half of the first half and the second half of the field were also matzav together, where both were Hiviyah Shlish and they weren't cut. So the Mela comes out that there's three parts of the field. There's the first part of the field, which was cut before the second half was in Bechlal Hiviyah Shlish. So they obviously have no tziruf. There's the second half of the first half, which on one hand was together with the first half, when the first half was Hiviyah Shlish. When the first half of the first half was Hiviyah Shlish. And it was also together with the second half of the field, because when the second half of the field was Hiviyah Shlish, she was still there. He wasn't cut yet. So Memela, the first and the second have a shaykhus, the second and the third have a shaykhus. But the first and the third, the first means the first half of the first half, which was cut before the second half of the field, was Hiviyah Shlish, have no shaykhus because they weren't in the same world together. Masha'in came, the middle one, which was the part that was cut, the second part of the first half, which was cut after the second half of the field brought a shlish. So they have a shaykhus to both. He has a shaykhus to the second half of the field because he was there together. They were growing together, and they were both Hiviyah Shlish. And he has a shaykhus certainly to the first half because he was Hiviyah Shlish together with the first half. And the fact that the first half of the first half was cut, that doesn't change the fact that he has a shaykhus with it. That's this. Maybe we're making it more complicated than it is. Halacha Yud Zayin. Soda shehigia chetzi at shlish. You have a soda which half of it reached at shlish, and v'chetzi lehigia. And then v'hischel v'kotzar b'chetzi shehigia chetzi. He started cutting the first half, which was already higia chetzi. He didn't cut all of it. Let's say he cut half of it. And v'char kach hivia kula shlish. And now the second half of the whole field brought shlish. Now v'char kach now is gomer achetzi arishin shehigia b'tchila. Now he finished cutting the second half of the first half, which was originally Hiviyat Chila Shlish. So the din is a mafresh min arishin al emtsoim. He can be mafresh min arishin al emtsoim. The rishon means the first half of the first half, the part that he cut before the second part of the field was Hiviyat Shlish. Al emtsoim means on the second part of that field, which was emtsoim. It's called emtsoim because it was on one hand it was still there. It was Hiviyat Shlish originally with the first half, and it was also there when the last ones were still there with Hiviyat Shlish. Is mafresh min arishin emtsoim or min emtsoim al arishin valachrim, but he can't be mafresh min arishin al achrim. That's the din. So Memela, the Peah could be even nifresh from the middle on the both of them, or the rishon on the second, on the achrim on the emtsoim, but not on the rishon on the achrim because they have no shaykhus to each other. Halacha Yud Ches. Hamecher mekaymis misadeu. He owns a field, and he sold different areas in the field to Lanoshim Harbor to different people. Is in Macher Kol Asoda, is Kol Echad Ve'echad Neisen Peah Achaz Michal Kishalaka. Because the Chi of Peah is by the Ktsira, and Memela, each person by his Ktsira, he has to give Peah for the Chelik Shalaka. However, V'im Hischel Bal Asoda Liktzer, he already started Liktzer. And then Umocher Mixas V'Shir, Mixas is part of the field. He still knows he didn't cut everything that he was going to cut. If a person cuts everything that he was going to cut, and then he sold the other half, so that we learned earlier. We learned that if he cut chetzia and then mocher chetzia, so the lekeach has to give also for the part that he cut, because the pay is in the second part. Mashenkin over here, he was sheer latzmi as well. Hischel balasoda liktzer, u'mocher mikzer v'shir mikzer. So he left part of it for himself as well. Is balasoda neisen pay haruya lakelo. Here comes vakert that the balasoda, since he was hischel liktzer, and he still has something left, that liktzer, so the din is that he has to give payah since he started with bekutzerchan, and it was his field, and he still has of the field, so he has to give payah for the entire field, also the parts that he sold. Shekiv shehischal liktzer nischayu bakel. That's only talking about if he was hischal liktzer before he sold. However, in mocher tchila, if mafresh alikech al mashalokach or masbal soda mashashir. So in other words, if he sold originally, and then even though he left originally, but he didn't start cutting originally, so then the lekeach is mafresh on mashalokach, and he's mafresh on mashashir. So that was in the beginning of the halachos. He says, mecher mekamis musadeu lanoshim harbi mocher kol asoda. It's not. There's no din of a mocher kol asoda. L'chura, as long as he wasn't. You have to understand this din of mocher kol asoda. There's no really such a din. The din is only depends if he was koitzer or he was not koitzer. If he was koitzer originally, So then he was, and he left part of it. The din is pashut. If he started being koiter his field, and he left still part of his field, and he sold parts of his field, so then he's mechuyev to be mafresh peah from the parts that he left over, since on the parts that he sold. Masha'inken, if he never started cutting, originally, so it was never a chales chiyuv. So then, whoever buys, he has to be mafresh on what he buys. So l'chura, this din of imacher kol hasad, I'm not sure when is this din chal. Might have come in this imacher kol hasad. Halacha yutes, sdei ilon. We were speaking about what divides two fields. Sdei ilon, a mafsik bo el geder goveya habavdul bein hoilonos. In order for a sdei ilon to have a hefsik, it has to be a geder goveya, which divides between the trees. In other words, the fact that there is a gather, for example, of 10 tefachim, that's not called a gather legabi the trees, because the trees are much taller. And the shoots and the branches are mixing on top. And they're also touching on top of the fence on top. It's then now, the Rambam says, Mavdul habadim v'aperis muvdolim u'mayla, and also v'negim begeder al gabi, and the Derech HaMunah wants to say that you need hakabot tnoim. Sai, I'm not sure, may say that it's badim v'aperis muravim u'mayla, and sai, the noigim begeder al gabi. Al kol pan, like Vice, you need to, two dinim, say that they should be mixed together on top, and say that they should, like, so to speak, be mavatul the gather, because negim begeder al gabi is harezu kesoda achas, and therefore v'nesen peah lakil. Halacha chof. Shnayim shelokhu ilon echad is nesen and a peah achas, just like you have two people own a soda b'shutfis. So you give a peah achas, so the same thing, a ilon echad is nesen, meaning a peah achas. Lokav zet tzveini v'zet dreimei, so even though it's l'chura one tree, so moving, if you have a soda, one person takes tzveini, takes dreimei, so it's two separate fields. Masha'inkan over here, l'chura, it's the same ilon, so that's the chidush. Lokav zet tzveini v'zet dreimei, is that nesen peah la'atzmei, is that nesen peah la'atzmei, even though they're both growing together out of the same tree, but this person has the tzofim part of the tree, this person has the darn part of the tree. So each one gives peah for his part. Halacha chaf aleph. Hacharuvim carob trees. Why says carob trees? Because the Yereim writes that because their branches are so thick, so therefore they normally are very distant from each other. So that's why we're going to see a shiur of re'iyah. They're distant from each other. And on the other hand, if you don't see each other, so each one, since each one is like a big and very thick, so therefore each one is kiveh la'atzmei, and it's considered separate unless you could see each other from one charuf to the other charuf. That's what we'll soon learn. Ha-charuvim carob trees. Kol sha'odem eimed b'tzad charuf zeh, and v'chaveri eimed b'tzad charuf zeh, v'rein zeh zeh. They could see each other. One is standing on the one side of the carob tree, and the other one standing on the side of the other carob tree, and they could still see each other. So then harein kulim sadachas, therefore they're considered one field, and upeachas lekulam. Hayu shnei atzdodim rein esem tzoyim, vein atzdodim rein zeh zeh. If you have, let's say, a large area of carob trees, and you have area 1, area 2, and area 3. From area 1 you can see area 2, and from area 3 you can see area 2, and also 2 can see 1, 2 can see 3, but 1 cannot see 3. So then that's what he's saying. The sides can see the middle ones. Is mafresh mitzad echad min harishenim al emtzoyim. You could mafresh from 1 on 2, or from 3 on 1, 3 on 2. Umin emtzoyim al harishenim al derezah, from 2 either on 1 or on 3. Aval yafresh mitzad zel atzad acher. You can't be mafresh from 1 on 3. That's the din. It's a special din by carob trees, because carob trees are big and thick, and therefore they separated from each other. So over there, the shiur for it to be considered a sada achas is only if they're royan zeh. Only if they're royan zeh, then it has a din of a sada achas. Or else you have to be mafresh from each carob tree separately. Peah hazesim olives. So over there, there's also a special din that kol mashi yesh mehem beruach achas miruch yisrael, all the olives that belong to one person, obviously, that are beruach achas miruch yisrael, kegen zeisim sheyesh b'mayra v'ir kulan b'mizracha, Zarein Kesei Soda Achas, Peah Achas L'Kulam. It's a special din brought down from Yerushalmi, since they would all bring it to the gas. So Memela, the gas is Mitzarfon, and Memela, it's a special din that the Chacham or Masakin, that the entire tzad has a din of one field, and Memela it's Peah Achas L'Kulam. You have to understand, this din that they have a din of Ksod Achas L'Peah is a negel to a din Deiraisa. Peah is the potter b'trumas amaisis, and zeis medach mechuyev in trumas amaisis menatera. So by saying that Peah Achas L'Kulam, l'chura is saying that this Peah is first of all, that it's potter from Peah. There's the chi of Peah the chadin Deiraisa. I'll call upon him. Vaisus midrabanan, that's bring down from the Yisham and Drabanan, since they all go to a bad achas, so that therefore the bad is mitzarfan. And on the other hand, the Derech Hamunah brings that lepel, if the fact that they could see each other wouldn't be mitzarfan. In other words, over here is different than charuvim. By charuvim, the fact that they see each other is mitzarfan. Mashenk and by zeisim, over there, the fact that they see each other wouldn't be mitzarfan them. Dafka, the fact that the beruach achas, only beruach achas is mitzarfan. He says psachidish also that if the city would be round, it would be a round city, so there's no real ruach achas. So Mamela, all of it was mitzurf. It's also psachidish. Halacha chav gimel. So we're learning when a person cuts a kerem, it's called a boitzer. Different cuttings. Zeisim is called a moisik. For a kerem, it's called a boitzer. Now, normally you cut a kerem means you're cutting the grapes, the clusters of grapes, in order to have grapes. Now, there's a musig where a person cuts the grapes not because so much he's interested in the grapes, but rather he's interested that the grapes that are left on the vine should grow better. There should be more room for them, and they should become able to have room to grow. So that's not called a boitzer, that's called a meidel. Now, when a person's a meidel, if he has a din meidel, so then, since that's not really a psira, it's called a psira aroi, meidel, so therefore, for that type of psira, there's no chiyuv peah. And we learned this also before. So in other words, if a person cuts from a vineyard, and he's not cutting because he wants to cut it, but rather he's cutting it in order to help the vineyard that it should be able to grow better, that's not called a proper cutting, that's called a meidel, and therefore for that cutting you're not chayiv on peah. So later when you're going to give peah from the rest of the vineyard, you don't have to give a peah for that part. When is it called a meidel? Only if you cut it, if you cut it from two sides, so it's obviously you're cutting it in order to give room to the vineyard. Mashenkin, if you're cutting it from one side, so obviously you're cutting it in order to have these grapes. That's where you're cutting it from one side, and then it's not called a meidel, it's called a boitzer. That's the halacha. Halacha of gimel. Ha-boitzer es mikzas karmi mikan and mikan. It cuts from both sides, and the purpose is kedei lohakel me'al hagefen at sheyimtzu shara eshkeles revach v'yisifu. The purpose is that the other clusters of grapes should be able to have room and be able to grow bigger. So that type of cutting is not called boitzer, that's called huanikra meidel. But if he's cutting only from one side, he's not cutting like he says mikan or mikan, but he's cutting from one side, is eini meidel. And since he's not a meidel, lefichach noisen min hanishar, he has to give from what's left over, peah or royal akil. V'afal pisha batzer l'shuk, even though he was batzer l'shuk, in other words, he's selling it, and the other stuff he's really going to put legas, but nevertheless, that's called a proper p'tzira, and since it's called a proper p'tzira, so then, when he's later on going to give and cut legas, he's going to have to be mafresh peah for also the part that he was batzar limker b'shuk. And the chiddush is that even though this is limker b'shuk and this is legas, that doesn't separate it to be considered two separate inyanim, and therefore you could still give the peah from the part that you're going to be baitzer legas on the part that you were baitzer l'shuk. Since that psira l'shuk was something that was chayiv b'peah because it wasn't a meidel. Why wasn't a meidel? Because it was not miruach zu, but it was miruach achas. Avalim heider limker b'shuk. But if he was heider limker b'shuk, so then if it was heider limker b'shuk, he wasn't batzar, he was heider. Because it was miruach zeh, is einen nesen peah lezeh shehedel. Then he doesn't give, because since this was limker b'shuk and it was heider, so memela he doesn't have to give peah b'chlal. However, heider lavi b'beisei, if he was taka meidel, and those he cut it mitzad zeh or mitzad zeh. The purpose of his cutting was in order to make it easier for the other clusters of grape to grow. But he didn't go ahead and limkir bashuk, but rather he brought the part that he was meidel, he brought lebeisei. So then is Nesim min anisha sheiniach lidrech Peah achas roi lakel. So the Nekudas Adin is azay. If a person was medel, which means it was miruach zeh, and it was limker bashuk, so then he's potter mi Peah on what he was medel, and later on he'll give Peah on only what was left. Masha'enkin, if he was medel and he brought it lebeisei, so then even though it was taka medel, so then he's chayav Peah. And certainly if he wasn't medel, but it was mitzad echad, so it didn't have a din of medel and a din of a boitzer, so then for sure he's chayav bepeah. And later on when he's boitzer legas or whatever he's boitzer for, so then he brings Peah al hakel.